Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I am your host, Michael Manley, and due to some technical difficulties we had last week in our live stream, always a challenge when you're doing live streams, we are going to invite my good friend and colleague, Eric Beers, back to join us. And this time, I think you'll be able to hear him, which will be ideal. So welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you. Yeah, and they weren't little technical difficulties. It was really just a mess. So I'm sorry if anyone tried to watch us that day.
Yeah, it was a bit challenging, and one of the mantras that I'm embracing as I do this work is imperfect action, and that action was quite imperfect. And it is a challenge when you're a classically trained musician because we have complete nervous breakdowns when things are not perfect. So my perfection, mind went a little bit crazy, but then I just took a deep breath and said, you know what? Imperfect action, right? This is all about embracing the fact that we're doing good work and sharing and understanding that it's never going to be perfect. So that was an important reminder for me. And I'm very happy to welcome you back, Eric. And before we go into your current position, you are a licensed clinical social worker currently. Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit about that work. But first, tell us about your early career, because you did start in the arts.
Yep. So I, like a lot of kids in New Jersey in my generation, started a musical instrument in school in fourth grade. So I actually wanted to play bassoon, but they said my hands were too small. Start with clarinet, and you can change one day if you want. So I never changed, and it was mostly just a hobby. But once I got into high school, and I started to hear classical music, it was just random. I just started listening to some of my parents' records. Then I became more interested in what was possible. So I got much more serious in high school. And then I decided I wanted to go into music professionally. So that required going to music school. And also I had no other choice because my high school grades were so bad. But anyway, so I got back-to-back degrees, a bachelor's in music and a master of music at New England Conservatory of Music. Really, the only reason I chose to go back there was I had an opportunity to stay with Harold Wright, who was principal clarinet of the Boston Symphony at the time and was my idol. So that's why I returned. And then, like most musicians after school, it was a combination of freelancing and doing other work to really make a living. And then I was, in 91, I got a job playing in the Omaha Symphony in Omaha, Nebraska. So I moved out there and I played professionally in the orchestra for 10 years. And that was pretty much the extent of my professional career, because after 10 years there, I was about 38 or 39. And that's when I started to have thoughts about changing careers. But my time in Omaha was great. It was a good regional orchestra and a very good group of musicians with no interpersonal conflicts. So it was really a nice 10 years.
Great. And so when you decided to switch careers, you just decided that the musical chapter of your life as a performer, you were ready to close it. It wasn't like you had an injury or that you couldn't make a living. It was just a choice you made.
Mm-hmm. It was.
And so what was some of the thinking that went into that choice? Because most people that pursue any kind of discipline that is so focused, whether they're sports or music or art, they would have a lot of separation anxiety around leaving it behind. So how did you cope with that?
So this is something you and I have talked about. I think we probably talked about this when we first met 20 years ago at the AFM in Manhattan. But I do believe I'm a bit different than a lot of musicians. I love music and I still go to tons of concerts. I've always loved music. And it was a strong part of who I was for many, many years. But I also had a lot of other things I was curious about and was curious to explore. So the idea of doing something different was never scary or overwhelming to me. But what really pushed me to pursue those options were a few things. I really wanted more control over where I lived. Well, I was happy playing in the Omaha Symphony. Nebraska would have never been a place I chose to live simply because I'm not really wired that way. Midwestern life is very different, as is the mindset. So I was a much better fit on the East Coast where I grew up. So I really wanted to come back to the East Coast, and in particular, New York City. That was probably the biggest thing. But also, I was curious about pursuing other options. And I did also want to get back in the neighborhood of where my family was again. So those are, the main things. And like I said, happy in Omaha, but I felt like I'd done all the growth I could do there in many ways, personally, professionally, emotionally. And I just needed a different kind of experience that I felt I could only get in a much bigger city. And so I needed control over where I lived.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point. And it's something that I think, especially younger artists who are considering a career, have to really keep in mind is that, if you want to do these things, there's usually a very limited number of places you can live to do them. In the case of music, we do have orchestras all around the country, but it's entirely dependent on if you win a job where you're going to live. So having control of your living conditions and where you live was very important to you, and more important than figuring out where your next move was. And I think you and I both had similar experiences. And me, it was in another path I was thinking about, where I got off of a plane and I was like, there's no way that I can live here. And for me, it was Iowa. Sorry, Iowa, but it was just Iowa. And I was like, I went to an interview, and I knew that I was going to bomb the interview because I had no interest in the job. I was like, I checked out before I even got into the room, which was a little odd, but it was a realization that I didn't want to live in Iowa. And so you decided you really wanted to live back in a big city.
Yeah, and it was so strong because I mentioned this in our first take last week. My experience like that was walking off a plane for, it was a good job. It was, I think, assistant principal in Cincinnati Symphony, which is a major orchestra, good salary, and a much bigger city than Omaha, Nebraska. But I walked off the plane, looked around and said, not I can't live here, but I don't want to live here. Never took another, so I didn't do well in that audition because I lost my motivation, and I never took another audition.
Yeah. And that's, it's really great that you had that realization. And so when you first transitioned, you wanted to pursue meteorology, I recall.
Yeah, I started dabbling in lots of things through volunteer work and taking various just individual classes in a Omaha Metropolitan Community College. So it was really inexpensive. So I just started looking into different things, and it came down to, it was going to be one of two options. I was fascinated by the weather, and I had nieces, and I liked kids. I learned I really like kids, and am very natural in some ways around them. So, but what I tried first was weather, which meant in Omaha, while I was still working, going to school part-time, taking physics, chemistry, calculus classes, and then getting accepted to Georgia Institute of Technology. And I went to school there studying atmospheric science. But it was a poor fit. It felt wrong practically from day one when I got there. And so after a semester, I quit.
And how was that? Because I would think with our classical music backgrounds, if you try something initially and you fail at it, that you just immediately want to beat yourself up and say, oh my God, how am I going to pull myself together?
Yes, I did have that experience. It was actually somewhat demoralizing to go in every single class I had. I would go in and I felt stupid and I couldn't do it. And so there's the first feeling bad about not being able to do it when I thought I should be able to, when I did all the prerequisite classes and did them well, but this was just very different. And then, it was a really difficult experience to then quit because I had no idea what I was going to do. Here I was in Atlanta, Georgia. I'd only been there for 4 months, really knew one or two people, had no family there, had no career or educational prospects there. And that was that. So you take a risk, but if it fails, which I did, you recover, and you take the next steps once you recover.
Yeah, and I think failure is something that if you're in other fields, research and development, for example, I mean, failure is something people love because they know they're not going to go to the next level without failing. So it's something that can be embraced. But in my experience, in our work, we, as a trained artist, we just see it as a referendum on our own self-esteem, and we use it as an excuse to beat ourselves up. And we are always striving to be that level of perfection, which is really kind of unrealistic at the end of the day. So once you realize that, you're like, okay, this isn't working. What happened next?
Well, that's when we met. I started, here I am in Georgia trying to figure out what to do. So I just started calling around. Now, mind you, I did have a nice cushion. When I left the Omaha Symphony, I took a year leave of absence. So I could have, and I quit school in January. So I could have chosen to go back to Omaha and begin the next season in September. So I did have that nice cushion. However, what I did started calling around to see where I was going to go and what I could do. And it worked out. It was really somewhat of a lifesaver. The National Musicians Union needed a contract administrator in the Symphonic Services Division, which is the division that works with symphony orchestras all over the country. I was a symphonic musician for 10 years, longer than 10 years, but I was professional for 10 years. And I had been a ROPA delegate, which works with the AFM, Regional Orchestra Players Association. And I knew a lot of people at the AFM because I'd been an activist to some extent. So I had connections. So I was able to get the job where I met you. You were already there, but that worked out really, really well. It let me go to New York City on a salary that wasn't great, but I could live in New York City on that salary. So that's how I ended up in New York City, or that's what enabled me to go there.
Right. And so in that position, when you were working in symphonic services, did it give you any new insights into the minds of classical musicians or the field as a whole?
Oh, it sure did. I'm trying to think of ways to word things that are kind to everybody. And I mean that seriously. But okay, so orchestral players, the orchestras they're in, they're divided into like primarily three categories. You have community orchestras, which are, it's mostly people that are playing for fun and don't get paid. It's not professional. They're 100% professional and earn their money outside of that. You might get the concertmaster, the conductor, a few principals that are paid, but primarily it's all volunteer. We're here just because we love music. Then you go next level up and you have regional orchestras. And regional orchestras really run the gamut from, like, you might have 10% of the musicians that are earning their living in the orchestra to like 50 to 75%. It really depends on the individual orchestra, but it is not an orchestra with 100% of the musicians earning their living only from playing in that orchestra. And then you get to major orchestras, which there still can be a mix of full-time and part-time musicians. But there's more orchestras where 100% are getting their living that way. And that's where you have all the orchestras whose names we all know, like Cleveland Orchestra, New York Phil, Boston, So in Symphonic Services Division, I primarily worked with regional orchestras and major orchestras. And I really came to see very significant differences in how they experience their work, and then almost like their personality makeup. So what my observations were, I was, from when I was a little kid, not a little kid, but like a freshman in high school, my goal was to be principal in New York Philharmonic, principal clarinet. Well, that didn't happen, and that's okay. Yeah. But the point is that lots of classical musicians, especially wind players, grow up, I'm going to do this. This is the only thing I can do. My life will end if I can't. And so you would think, once getting that job, total happiness and joy and elation. And probably when they first begin the job, but overall what I witnessed is much more job satisfaction with musicians in regional orchestras, much more job satisfaction overall. And also, what's the way to word it? Much more job satisfaction. It seemed from my observations and overall life happiness and adjustment to their lives and being content and being able to stay at peace in their lives, for lack of a better way to say it.
And why do you think that is? Do you have any theories?
Well, this is totally theories. I've obviously done no research on this topic. I think many things. There is the drive to be that successful, so much time alone in a practice room and being such a perfectionist that when things aren't working perfectly or don't go just the right way, it's hard to tolerate it because we're used to having to fix every little thing so we can get on that stage and play the excerpt just the way I need to in order to win. Something, part of it is the mindset. I have no evidence of this, but I really worry about the effect of ability to relate interpersonally when so much time is spent in solitude. I have no evidence to back this up. But I would get lots of calls. I mean, there's just a lot of interpersonal problems in some of the bigger orchestras that really seemed, that were very difficult to try and help them resolve. I also think there's something about once you get that kind of position, maybe if there's an expectation of how we should be treated and who we are and the expertise that we have and what we bring here. And so in turn, how we should be treated and what we are entitled or what we deserve to receive because of that degree of expertise. And there seemed to be a very high threshold of what their job should be and how they should be treated. So again, these are my observations, and depending who hears this, there may very well be people who dispute that, and I accept that, and I could probably have a conversation with people forever. With people in regional orchestras, there's just a much more overall satisfaction and still love of really just being in the music that seem to really take precedence over everything else about their experience for the most part.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at play. And first of all, I would say that from a talent perspective, all the musicians in the New York Philharmonic are severely underpaid, right? Like if you're playing clarinet, that's like being a pitcher of the New York Yankees. So from a talent perspective, musicians are underpaid, right? But all artists are in some respects.
That's a very good point that you make. It is.
But I think actually money is not the motivator here. Like money is not tied to the happiness factor. But I do think that agency and creativity are different for the smaller orchestra musicians, because when you're at that level playing in the New York Philharmonic or the Chicago Symphony, and it's, you know, you get some weeks off in the summer, but it's basically a 52-week-a-year job. You know, it's an extreme amount of pressure, and you don't have a lot of control. You're playing the music the conductor tells you to, the way the conductor's telling you to. And so you have a lot less agency than if you're playing in a smaller orchestra, but you're also teaching, and you're also, maybe have your own chamber music group on the side. And there are all kinds of ways where you can be happy, even if in most cases you're probably making less money than the people in the larger orchestras. So I do think that is somewhat of a factor. And one of the things that I was talking to a colleague just today whose husband was playing a Cirque du Soleil show for years here in Las Vegas, and now he's coding for Microsoft. And she remarked that, like, he's more of a jazz guy, a composer, and playing the show is extremely uncreative, right? And so I do think that even if we look at the Cleveland Orchestra or the Chicago Symphony, over a 20-year span, it's pretty limited what they're playing. I mean, it's great music, right? But after you've played Brahms 17 times, you're like, okay, let's do something else. So I wonder if the lack of creativity is also part of it.
It gets stagnant, kind of what you're saying.
Yeah. And there's more creativity sometimes outside of the arts, where we have a little bit more freedom and more control over our schedule. And but people don't realize, I guess, And I think that it's almost like psychologically it explains the sort of paternalistic parent-child relationship that I feel like artists sometimes are victim to, right? Because they're told they're told what to wear, they're told when to show up, they're told what to play, they're told how to play it, and it's just like you have very little agency, and that's got to have an effect on you if you don't have other outlets, for what you're doing. And in the case of a theater musician, you're not only playing every week, but you're playing the exact same music 8 times a week in cases, right? So if you don't have a creative outlet, and if you don't see the job in perspective, which is like the healthy attitude, I think, is this is a great, I'm very fortunate to make money playing my clarinet or my French horn. And I also have these other interests, which my job allows me to pursue because it provides me the income I need to survive and to thrive. But I also have other things to keep my life in balance.
And I also wonder about, like, in regional orchestras, there seems, especially compared to, like, the big orchestras like Cleveland, New York, Boston, like we would have we'd have the classical series, we'd have the pop series, we'd have the family series, and then we'd have a whole slew of educational concerts, and then the chamber series. Now, some of those series were more enjoyable than others, of course, but it did offer a lot of variety. And I wonder sometimes, like when you get the big orchestras, it's really pretty much classical 24/7, almost the whole 52 weeks that they work. And so I don't know, it might not offer them anything to play pop's music or to do something different, but I don't know. The jobs in regional orchestras seem to be a bit more diverse as far as what the duties entailed, what types of music they were performing.
Yeah, and I think there's often more opportunities to speak publicly in that on that level orchestra, because they do want a more personal relationship often with their audiences, and have other roles, like you say. So, what are some of your favorite? If you can think of a moment when you were playing clarinet back when you were a performer, what's the opposite? What was your greatest performance memory? Do you have one?
Oh, geez. I don't know if I have a greatest performance. I mean, there's certain. Okay, so in Omaha, I was second clarinet and E flat clarinet. Everyone hates the E flat clarinet except for the people that play it. It's loud and you can't help it. It's just loud. You can't help it. Anytime I just loved playing E flat clarinet. The parts were fantastic. But we had a conductor there in Omaha, Victor Yampolsky, a Russian guy. He had played in the Boston Symphony and then became a conductor and a professor at Northwestern University. He was the music director there. Whenever he would conduct the Shostakovich Symphony, those were really, really fun. So those are probably some of my really fun moments playing Shostakovich symphonies, E flat clarinet parts.
Awesome. And do you have any favorite performances that you listen to?
Well, the first piece I ever fell in love with, one of the records my parents had, was the New York Field recording of Tchaikovsky Fourth with Leonard Bernstein. And when you see the cover, it is all men, one woman, the harp player. So it's an older recording.
Yeah. Wow. And what about live performances? Because I know you still go to a lot of concerts.
I do. And my favorites are, I go to Carnegie Hall. Those are my favorite ones because it's touring orchestras. So it's one of the most wonderful things about living in New York City. Everyone comes through Carnegie Hall. So, I regularly hear Berlin, Vienna. I mean, every fantastic orchestra. So those are my favorite concerts, the Carnegie Hall concerts with the touring orchestras.
That's great. And if you had any kind of advice you would give your younger self or a young musician that's thinking about wanting to be a classical clarinet player or a string player, taking auditions, what would you tell them as far as advice on how to succeed and keep their in a way that's healthy and fulfilling?
Wow. Yeah, I remember we touched on this last time. It's a really tough one because I do believe I've always been very aware of my internal, like when I feel something strongly, I honor it. And I think it's important to know how we feel about things and to follow those feelings. Because from my experience with myself, is that's what's been most truthful and accurate. When I follow it, I get usually the best results. So, when a musician feels that that's what they have to do, that's what they have to do, and they have to honor it. What I would suggest, though, is, and I'm going to use the same example I used last week, about how I'm a tennis fan in general, and I love the Williams sisters, and they got a lot of criticism early in their career when they in their teen years, because they were also wanted to study. They studied art, they studied languages, they studied design. Serena tried to be an actress, was on like an episode of ER, and they had a lot of criticism saying their greatness in tennis is going to be affected because they're trying to explore too many things and their focus should only be on tennis. It's clear that everybody was wrong. Serena Williams won 23 Grand Slam tournaments, and some consider her the best female tennis player ever, and some people say the best female athlete ever. So it's good evidence that no, you can pursue different things, and I also think it makes us a more well-rounded individual. So my point is, yes, if you're committed to music and that's your passion, do it, but also be aware of other things, and also just try and pursue other things just as interests, because it helps keep us. I don't know. I just think it keeps us more well-rounded, and just be aware of other interests you have and pursue them. Maybe not as passionately or as diligently, but be aware of them and honor them and keep them in your life. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, and I feel like with sports, we have a lot of people that play college baseball or football that then go on to be professionals, but we don't have majors in football. But we do for something similarly specialized, like playing the violin. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I would advise my younger self and anybody who asked me for my advice to double major if I was an undergraduate, or major in something else besides music, and then focus on your grad years on a more specialized degree, because I do think it's important to have those other interests. And I think we all have them, right? If we're honest with ourselves, there's always something more we want. And when you're young, and for me, at least, college was relatively affordable back then. I kind of regretted later in my life not pursuing some more external musical interests that I had. So I do think that's really important. And, a lot of time, even in college, as you know, is being in a room practicing by yourself. And it's like, you can do that for the rest of your life when you're out of school, and use school as this great platform to really explore and be curious about the world. I think that's really great advice. So any advice from your current career? Because we did want to touch on the fact that you're a licensed clinical social worker.
Yeah.
And you mentioned last time that career affords you a lot of creativity in terms of your work.
Sure.
And because every case is different, and you have to respond almost like improvising in music, right, with the person. Is there anything that you've learned in your work as a social worker that would give you insight into how artists can approach their work with a healthy mindset, or with a way where their mental health will be protected, and some pitfalls they might avoid as far as that goes?
Oh gosh. That's a new question. It kind of goes back to like when we were talking about the difference between regional and major orchestras, and the ability, what can happen when people are isolated for so long. Like we've seen with COVID, the damage that can happen when people are isolated. Now, that's not the only thing that happened during COVID. There was also the issue of people being worried about dying, and just the whole world dealing with a pandemic. But I've seen that how poorly kids did when school was only remote and losing out on the socialization. It's done horrible damage, and it's considerable. I think it's done more damage than people would have assumed that it would do. There's some kids that are never going to catch up in some ways. So I would say one thing is that, yes, while it's fun to practice and we have to spend so much time, don't let it be at the expense of still having connections with people and being involved with people interpersonally. Still have a life in addition to your music. Stay involved with people and explore other things. And also, I remember last week you also asked the question about would I have any advice for someone who's thinking of changing careers?
Yeah.
And in the moment, I didn't know what to say. Also, we had the reception problem. But, one of the things I thought about afterwards that I actually did is it's great to have friends. We're always going to have music friends, but to have friends outside of music as well. Because I remember when I was thinking about changing careers, whenever I mentioned that to a musician, they would almost look at me like they were appalled. And sometimes it wasn't good to talk to other musicians about it, because it was you'd almost get a sense of like you're betraying something, like that feeling like, both our mothers have passed, but, the kind of guilt you feel if you haven't called your mother for a few weeks. It's almost like there's a guilt if you're not a musician anymore. And other musicians would be like, they could not conceive of getting out of being a musician. So they weren't very good for feedback because they could only see it one way. So point being is that, if you think about switching, also talk to other people outside of music, because you're going to get a much, much different kind of feedback. But also when being a musician, also have friends outside of the field to just, being a musician can become our whole life in every way, professionally and personally and emotionally. And you just want to be as well-rounded as possible. So if things don't go the way you might hope, you have lots of other things in your life, other kinds of friends, other kinds of interests. And to just, to keep all kinds of doors outside of music open.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation. And I noticed that same kind of thing where I've had a really bizarre career, and it's been extremely weird in that once you've done what you've done and you leave a playing job or a playing career, it's almost unheard of to go back to it. And I've had the experience of leaving and returning and then leaving again. And, when I first started in New York, I was freelancing. And so I was subbing on Broadway and I played in regional orchestras, and people related to me as a musician. And then years later, I was, back working at the American Federation of Musicians, and I had a completely different role. And people, they just relate to you differently. And it's almost like you were like a really high-rolling born-again Christian that somehow left the church, and now you're like on the outside in a way that's a little strange. And I noticed it a little bit with my colleagues in Las Vegas, although I do a little bit of playing here and there. But yeah, it's definitely important, I think, to have those connections outside of music. And I don't know why it is that and I don't know if it's, again, because of the self-esteem thing or because of the transactional relationship people have. It's like, well, if you're not in the scene playing, Eric, I just don't know how much value this is going to be for me, because you may not be able to give me a ride home from the gig or hire me for something else. I don't think it's that transactional, but there is an aspect of that to it, I think.
There's also sometimes I felt an assumption that you just don't understand it or get it, and you couldn't possibly understand it unless you're also on this level.
Yeah, there is that too. It's like being a Scientologist, maybe on, a second level Thetan or something. I don't know what the analogy is, but I have this story that a friend of mine told me, and I thought it was so perfect because it's such a great example of this, where there was, I think it might have been clarinet as well. Like a young woman was studying clarinet, and with a very, very important teacher, ended up going into education and other work, and became the director of education for Carnegie Hall, which is an extremely high-level job.
Yeah.
And her teacher came through playing at Carnegie, and they had coffee, and he was asking her what she'd been doing, and she said,
I know where this is going to go, but go ahead.
she's like, well, I'm the head of education and outreach for Carnegie Hall, and he's like shaking his head, going, you could have made it. You could have made it.
Yeah. I'm sorry for your misfortune.
Yeah. Like that's the mindset, right? It's so narrow, and I think that in a way, I think the big orchestra musicians also, I want to say there might be like a Stockholm syndrome thing going on where you're in this extremely imbalanced power dynamic where you've got conductor who has extreme amount of influence over you, and you're having to play perfectly for them every week. And you just, all of a sudden, your entire self-worth and self-esteem are wrapped up in what other people think of you. And if you played well that day. And I think that's part of the challenge too, is just keeping the perspective, especially when you're in those really, really hot seat positions playing concerts, all over the world, 52 weeks a year, and making recordings, which is even, I don't know how the musicians in Los Angeles do it. Like for me, playing a recording session would be the most terrifying thing I can imagine doing, because they're literally going in, sight reading music, it's got to be perfect, and they have no tenure, right? There's no tenured orchestra. If they don't play well on that gig, they're not going to get the next gig. So in a way, their world is even worse. But I think it's all about keeping a healthy mental balance, and again, other influences in your life besides music, because it is so focused.
Yeah, and my attitude, what we're talking about, was just the same. I mean, every person, I went to a conservatory, so I had, tons of musician friends and saw them go to different orchestras. And everyone's attitude in that first job is, oh, I'm only going to be here for a year or two, and then I'm going to move on. This orchestra sucks. I'll just be, and we all have that attitude because, like I said, when I was a freshman in high school, I'm going to be principal clarinet of New York Phil. Really, Eric? Well, it didn't work out, but so I get to Omaha, and I'm like, okay, I can be here for a year or two, and then reality hits. You might move on, you might not, but it's so damaging to stay in that mindset, because ultimately you end up taking it out on yourself. Because I'm sorry, no one's a failure because they're not principal of New York Philharmonic,
Right.
And it's a really damaging way to treat yourself.
Yeah, and it's also, I think I talked about this a little bit in terms of auditions, right? Like auditions can be very harmful if you're not doing them with the right mindset. And the only thing we can control is our intention, right? Like you can control how you're going to play the E-flat clarinet part in Rite of Spring by practicing, by preparing, by thinking about how you want to phrase things and going in and doing your best, right? What you can't control is like the outcome of an audition, right? So if you go into it thinking, if I don't get this one goal, then I'm gonna be a failure. Like then you're setting yourself up only for failure, because you can't control the goal. You can only control the intention. And I think that's something that is subtle, but I think a lot of people lose sight of it. The idea that like when you go to an audition, your job, if you go in thinking that you're going to win, right? Like then you're going to go crazy, because the only thing you can do in the audition is play your best. That's what you have control over. And if you start thinking about the outcome and what people are thinking about what you're doing, it's just going to drive you kind of crazy. And I think that's also true of performance.
Can I, you were talking about auditions. This is kind of unrelated, but I can tell the story in a minute. Can I tell the story? Because it is funny.
Sure.
Anyone who hears this will laugh. So it was my second audition I'd ever taken. This is back in 1989. And I was in the final round for assistant principal in E-flat of the Atlanta Symphony.
Wow.
So it's a good orchestra. I was playing well. So I'm playing the E-flat excerpts. I had to play Rite of Spring E-flat clarinet excerpt. I play it. These were my nerves. This is how disconnected I was from nerves. I played the E-clarinet excerpt. They say, "Thank you. Can you please do that again, but with B flats this time?" Yes. I literally played wrong notes. I'd been practicing it forever. And first of all, I didn't know I played wrong notes, and I actually did it. But hey, That's how nerve-wracking they can be.
Yeah, so that was your own nerves getting in your way.
Yes, I played a next. Yes,
that's amazing, and it's funny that you didn't hear it.
I'm surprised they didn't kick me off the stage. I mean, I played wrong notes.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, we all have audition stories. I mean, and the thing that I always say is like, again, it's all about your intention. The best auditions I've ever played in my life, I didn't win the jobs. There was 2 of them, and I thought they were the best auditions I ever played, and I didn't win, right? My favorite audition story is where I showed up at the wrong place. And the auditions were at the New York State Theater in Lincoln Center. And for some reason, I thought they were like across town at Carnegie Hall. And I showed up and nobody was there. And then I got a message, people are calling me saying, what's up? Where are you? And, or I was calling them. I think this was back when we had landlines only. But I showed up and I thought, well, they think that I am so mentally impaired that it does not matter how I play, because they just think that I'm the village idiot because I showed up at the wrong place. And so I had no nerves in that audition. Like, I played really well because I was like, well, they're never going to hire me because they think I'm so stupid. And then I won the job. So that was my favorite audition story. But my second favorite audition story was years and years later. I actually auditioned for the Phoenix Symphony, and I was not feeling as prepared as I should be. And this was not a far drive for me. I was playing The Lion King in Las Vegas, so it was a 4-hour drive. I went over and slammed a lot of excerpts with a practice mute in the hotel room the night before, and got up the next morning and could hardly play a note. And I went in and I played worse than I had ever played in my life, including in high school. And I was just like, well, that was that. What can I do? And sometimes it goes that way. You never know. You live and you learn. And but I think it's been a great conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to cover before we close?
No. I mean, I think we actually covered a few things in addition to last week. So, it's your scene here. I don't know if there's any question you have as for closing, but no. Well,
I think one of the things that I think I want to highlight, and maybe you can comment on, is just that a lot of people decide to switch careers not for the context that you had. So some of them may have experienced a debilitating injury. Some of them just realize, I can't make a living doing this. And so how do you hold on to your creative self and your inner artist while you have to switch careers, and even if you don't want to?
Well, first of all, I've always gone to concerts. I've always listened to music. So music never left my life. That's the first thing. Second thing is, you might surprise yourself. I assumed, even though I chose to change careers. Even though I made the decision, I wasn't forced. I assumed that I would not find another career that was as fulfilling. I was wrong. I love what I do. I have to work 9 to 5 somewhat and work 40 hours a week. So that's different. But you can be just as fulfilled, but maybe in a different way. Because, and it did surprise me a bit. So don't assume you can't find something that's equally enjoyable.
Yeah. And I think, using the example of my colleague here, who went into coding. I mean, apparently that's a very creative field. It changes every day, right? What you have to work on. So I think you're right. I think you have to hold on to the fact that whether you're a musician or an artist, that your inner creativity and your inner identity as that musician or artist doesn't leave you if you have to move forward from doing that specific skill.
Yeah, and like you had mentioned, and I said this last week, this is it's a very creative field. You have your education, all your studies, all your supervision, everything. But when a client comes in the room, when you're a psychotherapist, it's a different kind of communication. There's a feeling in the room that drives what you're doing, and you respond to each other. You create something together in a different way than music. but you're creating something together. It's very experiential, and you work off of one another. So it's very creative.
That's really fascinating. I wanted to ask you, like, if you're playing the clarinet and you have a performance that doesn't go well, you have to pick yourself up. Does that happen in your work now? Do you ever have things that don't go well, or that don't go well?
Of course, we have what's called in this business when there's a rupture. Essentially, ruptures happen when the therapist screws up, and it creates a problem in the relationship.
Okay.
But it's also very therapeutic, and ruptures are going to happen because no one's perfect. And it's a very important part of the therapeutic process because, as we all know, in real life relationships often have ruptures. And you get lots of people that come into treatment and they've had lots of ruptures and they don't know how to work through them and how to repair them. So they're bound to happen in therapeutic work, and they're very, very useful.
Fascinating. Well, I think that's a really great a place for us to close. And I want to thank you for sharing your perspective and your experience and your story with us today.
Happy to. And I'm glad the internet was much better behaved.
Yes, it's not like bad walkie-talkies like it was last week.
Yes.
So thank you again, Eric. Eric is on Facebook if you want to find him. I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn. And you can find the podcast on YouTube, also on Spotify, and join our group, Empowering Musicians, on Facebook. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye.